Hi everyone, thank you for attending our session focusing on leading successful change. I'm Kimberly Goh and I'm a legal director in Shoosmiths based here in Glasgow, and we are immensely proud to be supporting the Can Do Innovation Summit today. So, recognised as the most active law firm in the UK advising on M&A and particularly on venture capital transactions, Shoosmiths sees firsthand the lack of female investment and receiving end investments. Only 24 of the last 340 investments that we've advised upon have been into female-led businesses, so that's a mere 7%. And yet, according to the Minister for Women and Equalities, Kemi Badenoch, if they had the correct support and proper funding, equal access to funding, then female founders could add 250 billion to the UK economy. So some of you may have heard of the Pathways report, which was an independent review into female entrepreneurship in Scotland that was published in February of this year. In that report, it was noted that despite more than half of Scotland's population being female, 1 in 5 founders are women, and of those, only 2% of overall investment capital is invested into female-led businesses. So that's a pretty shocking statistic. And what's worse is I was at an event last week where Anna Stewart, who co-authored that report, was speaking, and she explained that despite government being really invested into that report and industry supporting its recommendations, in the last 12 months, that statistic has fallen to just 1.5%. So there's clearly an urgent need to sort things out and leverage the untapped pool of talent that we have in Scotland and to grow our entrepreneurial ecosystem through female founders. So how are we helping? In 2019, Helen Burnell, one of our corporate partners, founded Sphere, which is a community focusing on the venture capital space and looking to both support and empower founders and those in the industry to help to move the dial forwards. And today, representing Sphere, I hope to bring you an engaging panel discussion with some incredible panelists that we have here today. And each of these guys will bring a unique perspective into the topic of achieving gender equity in the fundraising space. So I'll just say at the outset, we're not going to do questions today because we want to maximise the time that we have speaking with all of our panelists. But if you do have any questions for us or for our panelists, then you can come and see us in our Shoosmiths Legal Lounge, which is in the Clyde Suite, just after the session today. And for anyone who's joining us online, our details are up on screen, and you can contact any one of us to talk about any of the events today. So, first, I want to intro each of my panelists so you get to know who we are. We have John Cushing, founder and CEO of MNAI. John is recognised as a top 10 innovative CEO, having spent 18 years building fast-growth, data-driven digital companies. His company, MNAI, is a multi-award-winning data insight and analytics platform, providing, amongst many things, real-time gender disaggregated data on all UK-registered companies. So it's John's MNAI platform that Shoosmiths uses to monitor investments into female-founded businesses. John's a passionate advocate for female entrepreneurialism, a founding member of the steering group of the Gender Index, a member of the All-Parliamentary Group for Women's Enterprise, and his data fed into the Pathways report that I mentioned earlier. We also welcome one of our very own female founder clients, Dawn Burrows, at the end here. So after 14 years at KPMG, focusing on large-scale operational transformation and the impact of AI and digital on the professional services industry, Dawn left KPMG in 2019 to found EngineB as a tech spin-out. EngineB is developing technology which provides professional services firms with access to standardised aggregated data to streamline their service provision across multiple applications. Dawn has just recently privately raised and may be fundraising again soon, so Dawn knows firsthand the challenges of managing a tech startup, spinning family life, raising capital, and all that entails. And finally, our final guest and our investor panellist, Claire Cram. So Claire is an investment manager for Par Equity and was the first female manager within Par, which is a leading early-stage venture capital firm. Par's investment model is designed to identify and back the most innovative and high-growth technology companies in the north of the UK. Par is based out of Edinburgh and supports technology companies in Scotland, Northern England and Northern Ireland. So welcome, Claire. So starting with you maybe, Dawn, could you tell us a little bit of your journey and what experiences that you have had as a female founder?
Gosh, where do you start? I mean, I think my path's been probably slightly unconventional. I mean, I never set out to be a female founder. I mean, I set out to be a female, but not a founder. In that, I mean, I went to university standard as everybody else did, left university with not a clue of what to do, and sort of stumbled and found my way into working in procurement and industry. And that led me to, after sort of 7 years working in industry in sort of various roles, I then moved to KPMG, where I spent, as you said, Kim, 14 years working in a variety of sort of large-scale transformational type client-facing roles, doing advising on sort of mergers and acquisitions and different types of transformation. And latterly, within the partner that I worked for, we then moved into internal roles where we started to treat KPMG as our own client. And we were really intrigued by automation and digitization and AI and what would that mean to a large firm in professional services. And for us, it became quite clear that the biggest issue was really access to data and standardized data. And I'm sure John will talk to us about data at length, but without data you can't really do anything. And we realised that the data that they had and the data they had access to and the way that all the firms were looking at it was very different, which seems bizarre because you would think an audit, for example, is a standard process. It's not. Everybody's doing it in a slightly different way. They all think the way that they do it is super special. It's not. You know, it can be standardised. So we worked very closely with the ICAEW, who are the Chartered Institute of Accountants in England and Wales, and they're our largest external shareholder now in Engine B. But we worked with them to develop a common data model, which was the first time that any of the accounting firms had decided that we should have a standardised way of doing things, of reconciling data. And from there, we sort of took the idea that is now Engine B to KPMG, and Microsoft supported us in all of this, and we left and we spun out to found Engine B. So we've been going for 4 years now. I'm the coup, which means I pretty much do everything outside of sales, and sometimes bits of that too. But we sort of grew from my co-founder and I, this time 4 years ago. We're now about 40 people. And it's been pretty hairy at times. I mean, it's a roller coaster. I mean, some days are great, some days are bad, some days are in the middle. And that's really how it goes. But I think looking back, one of the big lessons I've learned is that the constraint is quite often yourself. And I think, as I think back now, you know, if somebody had said to me 20 years ago, you'll be a founder, you'll run your own business, you'll set it up, I would have gone, no way, absolutely no way. And so I've probably been my biggest sort of, the thing that's been holding me back has been me. I think from a Raise perspective, we've been incredibly lucky. You know, we had some Innovate UK funding to start with, which let us get the business going and start to build the product. We've got a great group of angel investors, so we've probably got, I'm just thinking of the split male to female, we're probably about 25% female, which is probably higher than some of the others. I don't know from an equity perspective what the split would be, but you know, we've got some really supportive females. We have a board which is 50-50. So, you know, Seamus and I are really passionate that, you know, we should leverage the fact that I'm a female and that we're a female, partially half female founded business. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk more. Is that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we'll definitely be talking more. John, why don't you tell us a little bit about your founder journey and what led you to MNEI?
Yeah, sure. So this is the third startup that I've now had. So I came out of university. I did a degree in business and hotel management. And quite early on, I thought to myself that I wanted to stay in hotels. I didn't really want to work in them. And so I fell into recruitment. I came out of university, fell into recruitment. And recruitment is one of these industries that gives you the most amazing background. You know, you're dealing with payroll and contract law and HR issues and employee management. It's everything in one place. And that very quickly allowed me to start to spin up my own business. And so in 2005, I started my first company. We had a part exit in 2010, a full exit in 2012, and then went off and did the same thing again for my sins in 2014, and exited out in 2018. And the commonality of those businesses was all data. You know, how do you leverage data to drive decisions? How do you leverage data to be able to make more informed decisions at the same time? And so when we started thinking about the concept for the third business, it was very clear that a data-driven approach to problems that I had seen along the way, which related to how do you acquire companies, how do you invest in companies, what information can you learn about private companies other than Google and a spreadsheet, which was my best friend, by the way, for a long time. Still is, but don't tell anyone. And so we started conceiving this idea of deal origination using automation and using AI. And as you do, you go through various iterations, you build up databases, and you start to imagine what the world could look like online. And quite quickly, those ideas are dashed the minute that you get a client that comes and talks to you. And you know, everything that you've built, no plan survives contact with the enemy, but particularly when it comes to data and technology. And the two things that we learned quite quickly were, one of which was, we need to be able to understand the context of a private company against the macro, so i.e. what's it doing relative to peers or competitors. And the second part was, what's a company doing relative to its own organization, so the directors, the shareholders, and where else are they, and what are they doing? And so you start to build out bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger data sets until you turn into a data company. And that's exactly what we did. We pivoted into being a data company. Now my journey into gender disaggregated data and to ESG particularly was as a focus and a consequence of thinking about where the markets were going to go. You know, what do insurers need? Well, they don't need data on stuff they know about. They need data on stuff they don't know about. And so you start thinking about ESG. You start thinking about, you know, what do investment portfolio managers need? What needs to be done? And so you start to think about all the really hard to find data points and where you can get them. And it just so happened that the genesis of our gender disaggregated came not as a consequence of this blindingly big obvious insight that was standing and staring us in the face. It was a lunch meeting that I had with two female founders, and they'd heard about my story and they wanted to try and learn a little bit more about fundraising and what that looked like. And the thing that struck me about that lunch meeting, it wasn't, you know, how good their product was, and it wasn't how amazing the business was, and it wasn't what its massive growth cycles were doing. It was just how bad these two individuals felt about fundraising. And that's that's very opposite for me as a male founder. And so I went back to the business after lunch, and I said to the data science team, just how many others are there out there that are like this? And no one could give me the answer. And what was worse was when we then started Googling it, there was no gender disaggregated data. There was no industry stats on gender disaggregated data. And so therefore we thought we would build it. And so the very first algorithm that we built was to be able to understand what the corporate landscape looked like as far as directors was concerned. And then you push into shareholders, and then you push into control and management at the same time. And if we now fast forward to where we are today, as a business, we hold the UK's single largest repository of private company data. We track somewhere in the region of about 17 billion data points across 11.5 million UK companies. And a lot of the data that we hold is proprietary, and it's focused around ESG and particularly gender.
Yeah.
And of course that then leads to things like the gender index and the Pathways report, everything else at the same time.
And I mean, that's fantastic, because with M&AI and that platform, you're shining a light on the issue, and it's only when people can see the issue then that they can try to change it.
Yes.
Which is exactly why we're here today. So Claire, can you talk to us a little bit about your journey in PAR, and specifically what PAR is doing to try to redress this?
Yeah, sure. So I actually started off in marketing, have no background in investment whatsoever. Came over to PAR as the first woman on the investment team, which was a great experience, but to be honest, gender wasn't really at the forefront of what PAR was doing, and we focus on quite IP-rich, technology-heavy startups, and a lot of the time, founders of those companies in those specific sectors often aren't women. And we didn't think that we were being biased towards the opportunities that we were looking at. But I think, pattern matching habits, people invest in what they know. Something we found when we took a look at our portfolio was that actually we had a very low representation of female founders within the portfolio. Actually, only 10% of live portfolio companies had female founders as CEO. So on the back of that, we met with kind of that 10%, but also the wider portfolio, and said, what really can we do here to push this agenda, not only for ourselves, but also in the kind of wider Edinburgh and Scottish ecosystem. So we've been doing quite a lot externally, so through initiatives such as Investing in Women, Code, ESG, VC, and Future Asset. And we realized that that could maybe move the needle slightly, but in order to really drive a change, we need to focus the initiatives internally as well. So both through putting females into leadership positions internally, but also trying to change those pattern matching habits. How do we look at companies? So for example, if a female founder comes to us with an endometriosis platform and she's speaking to our largely male investment committee, and oftentimes they won't understand what that means. A lot of people will say, oh, I'll go home and ask my wife, but how do we actually make these things more relatable, especially when you're coming at it from an investor point of view? Because I don't think the answer is having these female founders change what they're presenting, change what they're confident in, and change their stories. I think, we need to have a difference in view on both sides of the table. So that's something that we're really focusing on changing, and I think it rings home to me sometimes sitting at a table full of men that I love working with. But I do think it does take a bit of a change of viewpoint sometimes. And the other kind of advice that I would give to any female founders, especially if you are kind of presenting to a team that's largely male, is really kind of be confident and stick with what you know. Because again, I think the last thing we want is for founders to feel like they need to change that story when speaking to specific investors, when actually that's not the case at all. And I think, we really do look for people that stand behind and own those businesses. So I think it's a difficult one. I think people can talk about it all day, and what are the reasons that we do have this disparity, what's behind all the figures that have been mentioned today. But I really think it takes, from an investor perspective, a bit of bridging on both sides of the table.
Do you know if any other firms are doing the same as you, private equity?
Yeah, I think a lot are, and again, you see, the numbers of female entrepreneurs, a lot of them say they're going down. I think it was 83% of UK VC deals last year did not have any women on the management team. And I don't think that's, the companies aren't there, but how do we bridge that gap? And I've said it a few times already, but I do think that people invest in what they know. So, for example, what PAR knows is often can be quite heavy, industrials, hardware sectors that might not resonate with businesses that women typically invest in. But I do think we are seeing other firms kind of follow in those footsteps and kind of, it's not going to happen overnight, but it is quite a large mindset change, and I think a lot of pressure can be put on companies to follow that, but I think investors need to kind of make that mind shift as well.
But is that not the problem, though? Is that it hasn't changed?
Yeah.
So I think this was one of the things that Anna Stewart called out with Mark in the Pathways report, was that it just hasn't changed in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And we see it even in our data today. We see the overall active female-led population is static. There's growth, but it's not the same levels of growth that you would expect to see with the attention focused into it just now. And it's the same with the angel investors and VCs as well, and trying to diversify and to broaden their base, but it doesn't seem to be coming through.
Yeah, and I think it is that kind of talking the talk without walking the walk, and people will say they're open, but you actually need to go put yourself out there. So networks, events, things like this, but I think it needs to go further, and investors need to actually commit to making those investments. So at PAR specifically, although we realize we have quite a low number of actual founding female CEOs, how do we improve gender diversity on the teams that we have already? And we've been able to tack that number up to 58% of our portfolio companies now have a female on the larger management team. So I think it's quite a new movement, I think, in the last 5 years in terms of the VC focus on it. A lot of people are signing up to these initiatives, but I think there is no real answer yet. But I think we need to get people actually investing in these things, not just saying they're doing it and saying they're signing up to various initiatives.
Yeah. And as you say, the Pathways report picked up on that. It talked about how there hasn't actually been a massive shift. People have been watching this and kind of reviewing it now for some time, but there hasn't been a big move towards kind of gender equity. So like, is there anything in the data that tells us why that is, or are we focusing on the symptom rather than the cause?
Oh, I mean, listen, this is a big issue, right? You know, this is a societal issue. This isn't something that one component part fixes. I think the interesting thing is when you start thinking about what we see across the UK and broken down into the different component nations. And Scotland and Wales have had a huge focus for the last 7 to 10 years or so on entrepreneurs in school. That when I went to school, I couldn't, well, even now, spelling the word entrepreneur is hard enough, but there are now courses being taught about entrepreneurism. And you see that Wales has had the most amazing ecosystem appear in front of it. It leads on fast growth, it leads on angel investment per capita, and it leads on the number of female-led companies getting funding. It's fantastic, it's done a really good job. Scotland happened slightly later because the Scottish Government put it into process in 2015, and you can now see that data starting to come through at the same times as well. Whereas for England and for Northern Ireland, there has been no approach to education, there has been no approach to entrepreneurism in education, and therefore you start to see tables lagging. And I think what's quite interesting is if you break Gen Z down, and we were talking about this offline, Gen Z female founders, particularly in Scotland and Wales, are far outstripping the active percentage. And that gives me great hope. That gives me something that can actually sit there and say there is evidence, hard evidence now, that we can measure a change. Now, if we can replicate that, then that's where it will happen. But you're not going to see the results for this for another 5 or 10 years. But the data does categorically prove that where education is concerned, you do then start to see the numbers increasing.
Yeah.
And if you can achieve gender parity, so there are multiple different states of gender. If you think about it from a corporate perspective, you've got male-led, you have female-led, there's corporate-led, there's unknowns, etc. But where you've got this, this really significant focus on the younger generation coming through, so Gen Z, you see this, that the numbers are ramping much quicker than for millennials or for any other generation at the same time.
And it sounds like the catalyst of all of this, it's a mindset shift. So, putting those roots in at an education stage and telling young people that this is a path, this is something that you can do, and they don't see the barriers that society has built up, that we all suffer from at our vintage. And then on your side of the table, obviously, again, it's about educating the investment committee. We need to look at this differently. We need to get these people through the door and proactively realise that there's potential here that we're not tapping into. So it feels like it's all a mindset shift. For you, Dawn, when you were coming through your journey as a founder, what were your experiences, and is there anything that you would look back on and do differently now that you've got the benefit of that insight?
I don't think there's anything specifically. I think going back to the point of the sort of the education, for me, that's super important. And when we'd been talking about this offline, my son at school was doing in business studies, he's in first year, well, he's in second year now, but last year they had to do a project and they had to do an entrepreneur, and he picked me, which I was like, oh, right, okay, because I thought he would have picked, like, I don't know, Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or somebody. So, so clearly that's working. But I think, going back to your point, Claire, I think what PAR are doing is fantastic. I think if I was walking into a room, clearly I'd be behind. My co-founder's the loudest person you'll ever meet in your life. So, he takes the room, and the guys are laughing because they know him. But, so I've never had that situation. But if I was walking in by myself to a room of an investment committee who are all male, that for me is the bit that needs to change.
Yeah.
If I was walking into a room and there's more than just Claire around the table, if there's a few other faces, that would make a huge difference. So you've got the education piece at one side, which is pushing women through and saying, look, anybody can do this. You don't have to be a man, you don't have to be whatever. You can do it and you can found a business, but you need some funding and you need some support. So I think that for me is changing. We've had quotas talked about in the past at board level, to have more female representation. It feels that probably in the investment community that needs to also be replicated.
Yeah. And actually so you're talking about walking into the room with your co-founder who's male, and that's something that I've heard on other roundtables, that that's a real thing, that we present, when I say we are females, we present differently, we appear differently, and that is actually part of our nature as a gender. So do you see that? Do you see when people are coming to speak to you about their ideas, do women pitch differently from men, and is there something that we can do here to kind of help people maybe present in a way that's going to be well received?
Yeah, I think women can tend to present differently than men. I think a lot of the time it's a bit kind of more risk averse, a bit safer. They really only want to come to the table when they know that they can, whereas I think men are more associated with kind of jumping, taking that risk, maybe going for it earlier than they should. It's again all stereotypes a little bit, but and again it kind of comes back to that, the investors need to look at it that way as well. And I think that's actually where you do get the biggest barrier, is that lack of understanding. So people not realizing, oh, this is a female founder that might present different than the male counterpart, and actually looking at that differently. I think that's where more effort needs to be made, is in kind of narrowing out that playing field slightly. Because in terms of PAR, again, we're mostly focusing on our key criteria in terms of technology, revenue metrics, what's really, how excited is the founder. It's not, we don't see ourselves as, oh, we're looking at this founder differently because it's a female founder. But I do think that can unconsciously slip through sometimes. So it's, how do we realize that that's what's happening? Because I do think, again, that's part of the reason we're not really seeing the needle shift at the moment, is a lot of that kind of, I don't love the term unconscious bias because it's assuming you don't know about it at all, but I do think that can be a key reason, especially at firms like my own, that you might do that on accident sometimes without knowing it. And again, it's that we stick with what we know. But yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you were talking about this, it's if you have people who have been through this process and they have maybe not had the success that they were hoping for, and they're a little bit more downtrodden and can't come into a room and present slightly differently, that sort of perpetuates. So it's about, or not ask for what they need, or only come into the room when they feel 100% ready, rather than going for what, reaching a little bit further maybe and just having less of a risk-averse nature, I think.
Yeah, because I think that's part of it, is a lot of the times you don't see the female founders actually going for the funding, especially at the earlier stages. A lot of female founders will try and get funding other ways. I don't know the exact stats on it, but I do know that a majority of them are largely bootstrapped at that early stages, and institutional investors don't get involved in female-founded companies often until much later than the male counterparts. So I think, again, advice to founders is really kind of play to your strengths, be ambitious, and even if you don't feel fully in that safety net, to really go for it, because I think that's again a large reason why people don't go for that funding until later on in the journey.
But is there not something, though, about the fact that a lot of entrepreneurs don't actually know about all the options that are available to them to begin with? So we did some work with the EISA, the EIS Association, about trying to quantify the universe of those companies that were eligible for EIS relative to those that then took it. And so for anyone who doesn't know, there are tax breaks in the UK set up for startups. There is the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme, and then there's the Enterprise Investment Scheme. And they help early stage companies to generate the investment capital they need to grow their ideas. And when we look at it last year, and we can only look at the figures once a year because they're released by HMRC, last year there were about 3,500 companies that took EIS, which is the later stage, and a further 3,500-4,000 of those that took SEIS. So 7,500 companies. But when you look at the overall universe of these, there's somewhere in the region of about 750,000 eligible companies. And if you then said that a company needs to be over a certain age, with a certain profile, with a certain number of employees, and is trading for a certain period of time, the number is still a couple of 100,000. And so if there's a couple of 100,000 companies out there that can benefit from tax breaks to support their growth, but they then don't use it, and if that's a percentage of a percentage, well, surely there's an educational need in a different context. There's an educational need there that says, if there's an awareness or a lack thereof that would help you grow your company to begin with before you would get involved with it, surely that's got to be something that needs to be thought of at the same time.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we keep coming back, I think, to education at various different levels, but I think there it's key as well. So PAR specifically, we've historically largely only done EIS investments, so that's a criteria. So a lot of people that come to us will specifically be ready for EIS and be looking for an investor in that space. But I do know ESA, which you mentioned, is very proactively trying to educate the market on that. I think also looking into various forms of grant funding and pre-seed funding are also critical as well. And I think there is a large gap in terms of what people know that they have access to. So I think as investors, again, that's something we need to work on, is educating people and kind of putting our names out there through events like this even, and just letting people know that these options are there.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll have funders in the room, we have investors in the room, people like me who are advisory, who are kind of here to support both. So when we're looking at the fundraising landscape and thinking that we have to shift this, what would be anyone, open to the floor, anyone's top tips on, what we can do to help move the dial in the correct direction? Do we think we can't educate, but what can we do?
I would say you can monitor and you can measure.
If you can see it, you can fix
yeah,
it.
Exactly
Yeah.
that. That's the first starting point, isn't it? Is no matter how bad it might be, rip the Band-Aid off. It's never going to be truly as bad as you think it is. But the minute that you start to measure is the minute that you can start to manage. And so for me, looking at data all day long, my instinctive reaction is, well, I can't educate, but I can watch. So I would monitor.
I think from an investor point of view and in terms of what we could do more to move the needle, I think we need to actively go out there and find those female founders, also setting kind of KPIs and holding the investors to achieving these levels. If we're not actually seeing the numbers move, why is that? We need to be holding ourselves to a certain standard. And in terms of kind of founder advice, I'd say also be picky back at your investors. I think people can see investors as, oh, we need to pick where the money is and who will give us a term sheet, but you are entering a long-term relationship when you go into the funding journey. So I think you need to do your diligence back and be just as picky when you're looking for an investor.
I was going to say, I think that's quite an interesting one for me because we've just been going through sort of a pre-process recently, and all of the companies we've been talking to, as I've looked around, it's sort of the potential buyer landscape. Every single person in the room is male. On the other side, not one, there's not been, actually I lied, one of them had a senior female there, but everybody else was male. So for me, I think it's quite an interesting way of thinking about it, as we start to look at somebody who may want to invest in H&B in the future. If I want the company to be diverse, then I should want investors to have the same mindset or to be from a diverse background as well. So yeah, I think that's one I would be taking away.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a positive. You can absolutely leverage that you are a female founder of a tech business, and that's incredible, and that you can lean into that completely. And so people like Power would be willing to come speak to you more so, because diverse boards bring better results.
Because I know that Power is so diverse.
Great. Well, I don't know how. Yeah, I think we are running over time. Apologies. So, I expect a lot of what we've spoken about today resonates with some of you. And whilst we can't take questions here because we have overrun on time, we do have our panellists over in our legal lounge for the next half hour or so. So if you have any questions for any of them or any of us, then do please pop along. And again, our contact details are on screen for anyone who is joining us online. But thank you so much to the Summit for letting us come and speak and share our experiences. And thank you so much for our delegates for their insight today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.